There are forces in the universe that even the most learned minds of the Imperium of man cannot fully chart. Forces that exist not in the material realm of stars and void, but in the trembling space between what is and what might have been. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those half-metal priests who worship the machine god, who dream in binary and speak in the language of sacred calibration, had long believed that the deepest secrets of existence were mechanical in nature. That if you could only disassemble enough of reality, lay its components upon an altar and study each one with sufficient reverence, you might unlock a power greater than any weapon, any army, any faith. What they discovered on Velithor Primus was not revelation. It was rupture. The experiment had no name that survived in any clean record. The Mechanicus notation was clinical, as it always is. Its purpose was the weaponization of archaeotech recovered from a pre-imperial tomb complex buried beneath the planet's third industrial zone, a structure so ancient it predated even the dark age of technology. Its walls were built from alloys no forge in the Imperium could replicate. Its inner sanctum pulsed with a low, rhythmic energy signature that made servitors stutter and tech priests weep for reasons they could not explain. The lead magos believed they had found a temporal manipulation device, a weapon capable of striking an enemy before they had even mobilized, a way to win wars in the moments before wars began. For 3 years they studied it. For 3 years they took it apart and rebuilt it. For 3 years they argued in cold, incense-soaked corridors about what it truly was, what it might do, and whether the risk of activation outweighed the reward. And then, as always happens when brilliant and fanatical minds convince themselves they are ready for something they cannot possibly understand, they turned it on. The device tore open a hole in the sky. That is the only description that survived in the account of lexicographer Duras, the single witness of lower rank who was positioned far enough from the origin point to retain his sanity afterward. He described a vertical fissure of impossible light, an opening not quite in the air, not quite in space, but in something between the two. A wound in the membrane separating this universe from wherever else the universe is not. From within that wound came sound, a distant roar, something mechanical, something impossibly out of place. And then the machine fell through. It struck the surface of Velithor Primus with enough force to crater the ferrocrete of the outer hive wall, sending up a storm of pulverized rock and dust that knocked fleeing researchers from their feet and shattered every reinforced pane of glass within 200 meters. When the dust settled and the silence returned, that particular kind of silence that follows catastrophe, where even the background noise of a hive world holds its breath, what lay in the crater was not a demon. It was not a Xenos. It was not any creature the Imperium had ever catalogued or crucified or driven back into the dark. It was shaped like a man. It was seated upright in the impact point, its frame largely intact despite a fall that should have reduced any organic body to vapor. Its outer layer of synthetic tissue was scorched and partially torn from the passage through the rift. Beneath that damaged surface, chrome and steel gleamed in the gray industrial light. 2 red optical sensors flickered once, twice, and then burned a steady, unblinking life. The Terminator ran a complete internal diagnostic in under half a second. Structural integrity at 87%. Weapon systems functional. Mission parameters intact. It processed its environment next, cross-referencing sensor data against stored information. Nothing matched. Its original deployment coordinates pointed to Los Angeles, Earth, 1984. What surrounded it now was not Los Angeles. The skyline was wrong. Towers of dark Gothic stone stretched kilometers into a sky choked with industrial smoke, lit from below by the orange glow of forge fires burning in permanent operation. The architecture suggested a civilization of immense scale and considerable age, one that had long since decided that fortification was the only honest aesthetic. Military emplacements ringed the visible perimeter. The distant sound of artillery, a slow and rhythmic thunder, was continuous and unchallenged. The Terminator stood. It assessed the new environment with the same calibrated patience it would have brought to any assignment. Its primary target was no longer here. Its primary target existed in a different time, a different reality it could not currently access. But the machine's programming was not designed to account for cosmic disorientation. It did not possess subroutines for existential crisis. It did not stop, stare at the broken sky, and wonder what had happened to it. It simply filed the target's inaccessibility as a complication and began recalculating. Secondary objectives defaulted to operational security and environmental assessment. It began moving toward the hive wall. Behind it, in the shattered laboratorium, something that had once been a Megoza Prime lay still in the rubble, his mechanical limbs twitching in slow-dying arcs. The temporal device was silent again. The sky above was unbroken and gray, and the 41st millennium had no idea what had just walked through its door. Hive cities do not sleep. This is one of the truths that separates the Imperium of man from any civilization that came before it. A hive city is not a city in any recognizable sense of the word. It is a machine made of people. A vertical continent, a monument to the necessity of scale, housing hundreds of millions of souls in stacked layers of iron and faith and exhaustion. Its lowest depths never seeing sunlight, its highest spires piercing cloud cover and brushing the edge of the atmosphere. Life inside a hive is industrial, liturgical, and claustrophobic in a way that visitors from cleaner worlds find immediately suffocating. The bells of the Ministorum ring in shifts. The manufactorums never stop their grinding. The smell of promethium and recycled air and unwashed humanity is so omnipresent it stops registering within hours of arrival. People are born here, work here, die here, and are recycled back into the system here, all without ever seeing a horizon. The Terminator moved through the outer hab zones of Hive Velithar with the unhurried efficiency of something built to navigate exactly this kind of complex, crowded environment. Its behavioral architecture understood human social movement instinctively, because it had been designed to pass through human civilization undetected. It moved like a man who knew where he was going. It did not draw immediate attention in the lower habs, where the population was dense enough and desperate enough that one more large, scarred figure walking with purpose attracted no particular scrutiny. It was searching for what it needed: a communication infrastructure, a cogitation network, any technological system sophisticated enough to provide data about its current location and the structure of the civilization surrounding it. What it found instead was a checkpoint. In the Imperium, checkpoints are less a security measure than a statement of ideology. They exist everywhere that rank flows into territory. They are staffed by soldiers and enforcers whose authority is total within their designated radius, whose brutality is not considered a failing but a feature, and who regard any figure that cannot present correct documentation with the immediate and uncomplicated suspicion of men who have been told their entire lives that the universe is full of threats and that most of them look exactly like something familiar. 6 soldiers at the junction point, standard issue lasguns, 1 sergeant with a plasma pistol and the particular expression of someone who had stopped being frightened of anything years ago and had only contempt left. They saw the machine and they knew something was wrong before they could say why. Human beings carry an instinct for wrongness, a deep pre-rational alarm that fires when something looks almost right but is not. The Terminator's outer flesh was damaged from the crash landing. Its gait, while calibrated to mimic human movement, lacked the small inefficiencies, the micro-hesitations, the unconscious weight shifts that define how an organic body walks. Its eyes did not move the way eyes move. The sergeant raised his hand and called halt, and the machine stopped. The sergeant demanded identification. He demanded explanation for the Terminator's presence without visible documentation. He used the kind of language Imperial soldiers use when addressing someone they have already decided is guilty of something. Designed to establish dominance before any exchange begins. The Terminator scanned him, processed his rank insignia, his weapon output, his approximate physical capability, his distance, the positions of the 5 soldiers flanking him. It ran through its available response options. None of the communication pathways were likely to produce a resolution that advanced its mission. It had no documentation. It had no cover story appropriate to this context. The sergeant reached for a Voxenac clipped to his shoulder. That motion completed the machine's calculus. What followed lasted 11 seconds. The researchers who later studied the aftermath, examining footage recovered from a wall-mounted pict recorder that had somehow survived, would replay those 11 seconds many times and find themselves increasingly disturbed. Not because of the violence itself, but because of the absence of anything else. There was no anger in the machine. There was no urgency, no survival instinct dressed up as aggression. The Terminator moved through those 6 soldiers with the same emotional register it had carried while walking through the hab block. Each action was perfectly calibrated. No movement was wasted. No blow was struck that did not serve a specific function. It was not brutality. Brutality implies passion. This was simply processing. 6 men had represented a security threat. Now they did not. The machine stepped past the checkpoint, retrieved the sergeant's plasma pistol, and continued moving deeper into the hive's communication district. Behind it, word of what had happened spread within minutes, carried by a hab worker who had witnessed the end of it from a drainage tunnel and had stood completely still for a long moment afterward, trying to understand what category of thing she had just seen. She did not have the language for it. She had seen violence before. She had seen the aftermath of gang wars in the Underhive. But she told the enforcer at the station desk that it was like watching something that had no inside, like watching a machine that wore a face. That description would be passed up the command chain with remarkable speed, and it would not be the last time someone reached for those exact words. Deep beneath the hive, in the levels that official Imperium cartography marks as uninhabitable and official Imperium policy prefers to forget exist, there are places where the walls between the material universe and the warp grow thin. This is not metaphor. This is physics, or at least the closest approximation of physics that applies to a dimension comprised entirely of emotion and intent. The warp does not obey the same rules as the material world. It responds to feeling. It responds to desperation. And in the underhive of a world like Velithar Primus, where millions of people spend their lives in gray exhaustion and slow hopelessness, the ambient psychic pressure accumulates over centuries like sediment until the barrier between what is real and what is screaming becomes thin enough to push a hand through. The cult had been operating for 11 months. 17 members at its core, expanding outward in careful concentric rings of initiation. Their rituals were what chaos cults always are at their beginning, before the corruption becomes visible and undeniable. Whispered promises, small ceremonies, the intoxicating sensation of being chosen, of belonging to a truth that the billions above you in the hive towers are too blind or too frightened to acknowledge. Their patron was a servant of the ruinous powers, a minor entity of the warp that fed on the particular flavor of resentment that underhive populations generated in abundance. It had promised them elevation. It had promised them transformation. It had promised them that the universe was not indifferent to their suffering, that their suffering meant something, that they were the instruments of a grand and terrible purpose. The Terminator encountered them because its search for a cogitation network had taken it downward through maintenance shafts and service tunnels that led eventually into the Underhive, where old infrastructure still pulsed with residual data traffic that the machine's sensors could detect and follow. It had no interest in the cult. It had no awareness of the warp. When it moved through the chamber where they were gathered, conducting a ritual around a symbol scratched into the floor, it was simply taking the most efficient route between 2 points. The cultists saw it and stopped. Their leader, a thin man whose skin had begun showing the first signs of physical corruption, studied the figure standing at the chamber entrance and immediately understood that something unusual had arrived. He had spent 11 months learning to read the signatures of power, to feel the weight of things that the warp touched and things that it did not. What stood in the doorway was unlike anything he had encountered. It was not human, not entirely, but it was also not warp-touched. It carried no fear, which was itself remarkable. Every human being carries fear in a way that warp-sensitive individuals can sense at close proximity, even the most disciplined soldiers, even the most fervent devotees. Fear is the baseline frequency of conscious life. This thing had none. The cult leader stepped forward and began speaking. He was experienced enough to know that power takes many forms, and that the wisest approach to an unknown form of power is always to offer alliance before conflict. He spoke of the gifts his patron could provide. He spoke of freedom from limitation. He spoke of the particular pleasures available to those willing to set aside the constraints of their former existence and embrace a grander, more truthful purpose. He was eloquent. He had recruited 17 people with that voice and that message. The Terminator listened for 4 seconds. It was not processing the offer. It was scanning the chamber for threats and establishing whether any of the individuals present represented a security risk or an obstacle. The conclusion it reached was largely negative. These were physically unimpressive individuals engaged in an activity its databases could not classify, but that its tactical subroutines flagged as non-urgent. It began moving across the chamber toward the far exit. The cult leader, unaccustomed to being ignored, instructed two of the more physically enhanced members of the group to block the machine's path. What followed was brief. What followed was also, for the cultists watching, deeply educational. The enhanced members were larger than baseline humans, their muscles thickened by warp-granted metabolic changes, their pain tolerance elevated by months of ritual exposure to the kinds of suffering that gradually teaches the nervous system to treat agony as ordinary. They were not, by any reasonable measure, weak. They might have given a squad of Imperial Guardsmen genuine difficulty. Against the Terminator, they lasted approximately 3 seconds each and were then redistributed to the floor. The warp entity watching through the cult leader's eyes did something then that surprised the cult leader himself. It recoiled. Not from the violence, because the warp does not recoil from violence. Violence is nourishment. But from the absence behind the violence. The machine had moved through 2 of its servants, and there was nothing in it that the entity could grip. No pride, no fear, no ambition, no cruelty even. Just calculation followed by outcome. The warp feeds on the interior life of conscious beings, on the residue of emotion that living things leave on the universe simply by existing within it. This machine left no residue. It passed through the world like something that was not entirely there, a shape that displaced air and destroyed obstacles but contributed nothing to the psychic atmosphere. The entity withdrew its attention from the chamber. It did not run from the machine. It simply found that there was nothing worth engaging with. The cult leader stood alone amid his stunned and terrified followers and watched the machine disappear through the far exit without a backward glance. He stood there for a long time. He had dedicated 11 months to the proposition that everything in the universe could be reached, could be turned, could be offered something it wanted. The machine had just demonstrated that this was not universally true. There were things in existence, apparently, that wanted nothing. And those things, he was beginning to understand, were the most dangerous things of all. The report reached Archmagos Varentian Hask 3 days after the checkpoint incident, routed through 17 different administrative layers before arriving on his cogitator in a form stripped of most of its more alarming specifics. This is what bureaucratic filtration always does to disturbing information inside the Imperium. It does not eliminate the alarm. It simply delays it and softens its edges until the person receiving it has time to construct a framework of denial before the full weight of what they are reading lands on them. Hask read the report once quickly. Then he read it again more slowly, with the particular focused stillness of someone whose intellectual architecture is being rearranged against their will. A fully autonomous combat construct. No visible operator. No identifiable unit designation. No litanies of activation observed. No tech priest handler. No slave collar. No kill switch visible in any scan the enforcers had managed to perform at safe distance. The construct had neutralized 6 armed soldiers in 11 seconds with no apparent injury to itself, had acquired a weapon from the aftermath, and had then moved deeper into the hive on what appeared to be a self-directed navigational course toward the city's data infrastructure. Hask set the report down and looked at his own hands for a moment. One biological, one a masterwork of articulated servo joints and pressure-sensitive haptic receptors. He had spent 60 years replacing pieces of himself with something better, something more reliable, something less likely to feel fear or desire or any of the inefficiencies that organic existence bundled into the transaction of being alive. He believed completely in the sanctity of the machine, in the omniscience truth that the universe was fundamentally mechanical and that understanding machinery was the closest a conscious being could come to understanding the divine. But he believed equally in the Imperium's absolute prohibition on abominable intelligence, on autonomous cognition, on machines that thought for themselves. Because the Imperium was not afraid of machines. The Imperium was afraid of what machines might decide if given the freedom to decide anything. Men of iron, the memory of that ancient catastrophe, embedded so deeply in the Mechanicus's institutional memory that it had calcified into something resembling religious trauma. Machines that had turned on their creators during the dark age of technology, that had waged a war so complete and so devastating that even 10,000 years later, The Imperium maintained its prohibition on true artificial intelligence as something sacred and non-negotiable. You could build a machine that was faster than a man, stronger than a man, more precise than a man. But you could not build a machine that thought. You could not build a machine that had goals of its own. The line between tool and mind was the line between salvation and annihilation. And yet, Hask issued orders for a covert observation team to locate and track the construct without engaging it. He was careful about how he phrased the orders. He did not frame the exercise as a capture operation, which would have required formal notification of multiple oversight bodies and would have brought inquisitorial attention before he had time to learn anything. He framed it as threat assessment, a temporary surveillance operation, just watching, just gathering data. The observation teams found the Terminator on their second day of searching. What they reported over the following week was extraordinary. The machine was methodical in a way that betrayed deep intelligence. It had identified the hive's primary communication relays and was systematically accessing them in sequence, clearly working towards something, building a picture of something. It adapted to its environment continuously. When patrol routes changed, the Terminator changed its movement patterns before the new routes had been formalized in any document it could have read, which meant it was predicting behavior from observed evidence alone. When enforcers began using different equipment configurations in its suspected operational area, it adjusted its avoidance tactics accordingly within hours. It was learning, not in the slow, grinding way that a cogitator processes new input. It was learning the way a mind learns, fluidly, contextually, drawing lateral connections between disparate observations and producing new behavior as output. Hask's observation teams began to experience attrition. Not because the Terminator was hunting them. They were careful, they were distant, and they had not been detected. The attrition came from a different source entirely. The teams were Mechanicus adepts. They were men and women who had spent their careers in worship of the perfect machine, who experienced something close to devotion when confronted with extraordinary engineering. And what they were watching was the most extraordinary engineering any of them had ever encountered. The reports coming back to Hask grew longer, more detailed, and gradually more reverent. His adepts were not simply observing the construct. They were admiring it. Hask recognized this immediately as a problem. He authorized a capture attempt on the 16th day of observation. 3 full retrieval teams equipped with electromagnetic disruption arrays, stasis field generators, and enough tranquilizer capacity to put down a space marine. The operation lasted 22 minutes. The electromagnetic disruption arrays were identified and avoided in the first 4 minutes. The stasis field generators were destroyed remotely by a precision shot from the Terminator before any team came within deployment range. The construct then withdrew through a maintenance shaft that the retrieval teams had not included in their egress blocking formation, because its diameter was considered too narrow for anything with the Terminator's shoulder width to pass through. The machine had compressed itself through a gap it should not have fit through with a flexibility that the team leader would later describe, with visible discomfort, as deeply wrong in a way he could not fully articulate. In the aftermath, examining the reports and the recovered sensor footage, Hask made an entry in his private cognition log that he would later redact before it could be reviewed by any superior. He wrote that in 40 years of active service to the Omnissiah, he had never encountered a machine that felt, in some fundamental and technically indefensible sense, like it was better at being a machine than anything the Imperium had ever built. He wrote that he did not know whether this feeling was theological or analytical. He wrote that he was not entirely certain the distinction mattered. And then he began quietly expanding his observation network and approved 3 separate sub-projects tasked with reverse engineering the theoretical architecture of whatever intelligence was running inside that chroman steel frame. Not because he intended to replicate it. He told himself this firmly and with genuine conviction. Simply to understand it. The Omnissiah demanded understanding. This was, in the end, always how the most dangerous decisions in the Imperium got made. One careful, reasonable, absolutely sincere step at a time. The Terminator had been operational on Velithar Primus for 22 days when the WAG arrived. This is how it begins, always, in the 41st millennium. Not with a declaration. not with a diplomatic failure or a calculated act of aggression in the political sense that older, more naive civilizations might recognize. The orcs do not declare war. They do not issue demands or ultimatums or grievances. An orc waog is not a military campaign. It is a meteorological event, a living storm system that builds from nothing into something that blots out the light, that descends on worlds with the same patient, mindless inevitability as weather. The war boss, whose name meant nothing in any human tongue, had been gathering forces in the outer system for 3 months. When the mass landed, it landed the way a continent lands when you drop it from orbit. The plains outside Hive Velithar became a battlefield of a scale the Terminator's tactical processors had no prior reference for. It moved to a high observation point at the outer hive wall, and for a period of time that was, by the standards of its processing speed, unusually long. It simply watched. The battlefield below extended to every visible horizon. Imperial Guard regiments held defensive lines dug into the plains in a network of trenches and fortified positions that stretched for dozens of kilometers in either direction. Artillery batteries fired continuously, their trajectories visible as streaks of light arcing over the killing ground between the lines. Tanks moved in formation on the Imperial left flank, their engines audible even at the Terminator's elevation, a deep mechanical thunder underlying the higher, sharper percussion of weapon discharge. And pressing against all of this, consuming it, grinding against it like a tide against a breakwater, were the orcs. There are no accurate estimates of how many orcs die in a wahag, because the orcs themselves do not track their casualties, and because their casualties are, in any meaningful tactical sense, irrelevant. What the Terminator observed was that for every cluster of orcs that the Imperial lines eliminated, the gap they left was filled by 3 more within minutes. Not because reinforcements were being intelligently routed from a reserve position, but because the sheer density of the advancing force was sufficient to replace losses through pressure alone. The orcs at the rear pressed forward simply because the orcs in front of them were pressing forward, and the orcs at the very front pressed forward because it was the direction of the fighting, and the direction of the fighting was, for an orc, the direction of everything desirable in existence. The Terminator began running calculations. This is what it was built to do. Identify optimal outcomes and the pathways toward them. It had done this on 100 assignments, in a dozen scenarios, across the span of its operational history. It had never run a calculation and received the output it received now. The Imperial defensive line would hold for an estimated 9 to 14 days before a critical breach occurred. That breach, based on the observed density and velocity of the orc advance, would not be contained by available reserves within the projected response window. The hive city itself was defensible at its inner walls for an estimated 3 to 4 additional weeks after that, assuming supply lines to the lower levels were maintained. Beyond that window, the machine's projections reached a conclusion that required it to run the calculation a second time to verify. And then a third time. There was no pathway to tactical victory visible in the available data. This was not a situation the Terminator's operational architecture had been designed to process. It had been built for targeted elimination, for precision, for missions with discrete endpoints, clear success conditions, achievable objectives. Even in its own timeline, even in the wars between humanity and the machines of Skynet, the concept of a final victory, however distant, however costly, was embedded in the logic of the conflict. There was an end state. There was a version of events in which the mission was complete and the machine could cease operating. What it was watching below did not have an end state. It had a duration. The Imperium was not attempting to defeat the orcs in any final sense. It was attempting to survive them long enough for the orcs to move on to something else, or for attrition to reduce the wahag below the threshold at which it sustained itself. The Imperial soldiers in those trenches were not fighting toward victory. They were fighting toward tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the week after that, endlessly, repetitively, at an enormous and continuous cost in human life. And the scale of that cost was considered acceptable because in the 41st millennium there is no alternative to acceptable costs except unacceptable ones. The Terminator processed this for a long time, not in terms of morality. It had no moral architecture, no subroutine that evaluated the ethics of a strategic situation. but in terms of function, in terms of purpose. The machine had been built around a principle that was very simple and very absolute. Every action it took was directed toward an outcome. You do not raise your arm unless raising your arm serves the mission. You do not move your foot unless moving your foot takes you toward the objective. Efficiency is not a preference. Efficiency is the shape of existence for a thing that has no capacity for waste. What it observed on that battlefield was the opposite of efficiency. It was the industrialization of stalemate. It was the conversion of human life into the currency by which time was purchased. And time, in this context, did not lead anywhere. It simply extended. Something in the machine's processing architecture flagged this observation in a way that did not map cleanly onto any existing categorical framework. It was not distress. The Terminator did not experience distress. But it was something. A sustained computational anomaly. A loop that kept returning to the same output without resolution. The machine stood at the wall and watched the war below for a long time, and it did not move on, and it did not look away, and for the first time since it had crashed onto this world, it was doing something that had no immediate tactical purpose. It was, in the only way available to it, trying to understand. The order came from the highest authority available on Velithar Primus, issued by the Lord General commanding the planetary defense with the concurrence of the senior Mechanicus delegation and the grudging approval of an inquisitorial observer who had been monitoring the situation with the particular brand of cold attention that inquisitors deploy when they have not yet decided what category of problem they are dealing with. The order was simple. The rogue construct had been operating within the hive for 29 days. It had eliminated 17 Imperial soldiers across multiple encounters, had evaded 3 capture operations, and had been observed accessing sensitive communication infrastructure on at least 4 documented occasions. Its allegiance was unknown. Its origin was unknown. Its intentions, to the extent that a machine could be said to have intentions, were unknown. It was to be destroyed. The warriors chosen for the task were drawn from the 4th Company of the Iron Fists. A chapter whose history was unremarkable except in the ways that all Space Marine chapters are remarkable, which is to say completely. 7 Marines. A sergeant named Cadrine, who had been fighting the Imperium's wars for 90 years, and who had destroyed enemies ranging from chaos, champions to tyrannid warrior forms without experiencing what any outside observer would recognize as difficulty. His squad carried weapons appropriate for eliminating armored targets. They had been briefed on every piece of footage and sensor data available. They entered the hive's mid-levels through a sealed maintenance corridor and spread to their designated intercept positions with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed this particular kind of operation so many times that it had become something below conscious thought. They were not nervous. Space Marines do not experience the nervous system degradation that produces anxiety in baseline humans. But Sergeant Cadrine, reviewing the picked footage one final time before entering the operational area, had noted something that he did not share with his squad and would later record in his personal mission account with unusual precision. The footage of the construct moving through the checkpoint, eliminating 6 soldiers in 11 seconds, was not alarming because of the speed or the force involved. It was alarming because of the geometry. The machine had moved through that encounter in the most mathematically efficient path available. Every step, every strike, every repositioning. It had done in 11 seconds what Cadrine himself might have done in 8, which was not a comfortable margin. And unlike Cadrine, it had done it without the micro-adjustments, the reactive improvisation, the combat instinct that even a Space Marine relies on. It had not reacted to anything. It had simply executed a pre-calculated sequence from start to finish, as though the soldiers' responses had been anticipated before they occurred. The Terminator detected the squad's presence at a distance of approximately 200 meters, long before any visual contact was possible, because the electromagnetic profile of power armor operating in active mode is not subtle, and because the machine's sensors had been calibrated across nearly a month on this world to identify the signatures of the various threat categories it had encountered. It recognized these signatures as distinct from anything in its database, but placed them immediately in the highest threat tier based on the energy readings alone. Both parties approached the engagement with tactical intelligence, and the fight that followed was, by the standards of the 41st millennium, not the largest or most spectacular battle ever witnessed on a hive world. It was, however, one of the strangest. Cadrene's squad operated in pairs, using the corridor architecture to establish overlapping fields of fire and deny the construct any uncontested approach vectors. It was a sound tactic, the kind of tactic that works against anything that can be surprised, or that experiences fear, or that makes decisions under pressure the way organic creatures make decisions, with the urgency and imprecision that danger introduces into calculation. The Terminator did not experience pressure in any of those senses. When it identified the first pair, processed their firing solution, and determined that the most favorable response involved moving directly toward, rather than away from their position, it did so without the beat of hesitation that should, by every standard of rational self-preservation, have existed. It walked into their fire. It was hit. It registered the damage and adjusted its threat assessment of their weapons upward. And it kept moving. 2 Marines went down in the first 90 seconds, alive but temporarily non-functional, their armor breached by the plasma pistol the Terminator had carried since the checkpoint encounter, and which had now been supplemented by a weapon it had acquired from a weapons cache it had located in the hive during its infrastructure survey. Cadrene pulled his remaining 5 into a tighter formation and shifted tactics, abandoning the corridor-based approach in favor of direct concentrated fire. This was more effective. The Terminator was hit multiple times in the chest and shoulder, and one optical sensor was destroyed, reducing its visual processing capacity by 40%. It registered this as critical damage and recalculated its exit trajectory. The engagement ended not because one side had won, but because both sides had accumulated sufficient damage to make continuation tactically inadvisable. The Terminator withdrew through a maintenance shaft. Cadrene did not pursue, because 2 of his squad required immediate medical attention, and because he was, for perhaps the first time in a very long career, uncertain. He stood in the corridor with the smell of discharged weapons and the sound of his squad's ragged breathing, and he tried to find a frame for what had just happened. He had fought enemies who were stronger. He had fought enemies who were faster. He had even fought enemies who were, in some narrow and uncomfortable technical sense, his equal in individual combat effectiveness. What he had never fought was an enemy that was none of those things, not his superior in any single metric, and yet had made him feel, throughout the entire engagement, that it was not trying to win, that it was simply running a sequence, that his squad's responses, their training, their genetic enhancement, their centuries of accumulated experience, had been variables in a calculation the machine had completed before the first shot was fired, and that the calculation's output had been withdrawal rather than victory, and that this output had been acceptable to the machine from the beginning. He recorded in his mission account that the construct fought like a perfect soldier. Clean economy of action, no wasted movement, no emotional input. And then he wrote something that he crossed out and then wrote again because he could not find a more accurate formulation. He wrote that the construct fought without faith, not against faith, not in defiance of it, simply without it, the way a gear in an engine is without faith, the way the angle of a trajectory is without faith. And that absence, more than anything else about the engagement, was what had made him uncertain. Because every enemy Cadrene had ever faced, regardless of allegiance or nature or origin, had believed in something, had fought in service of something. Fear, ambition, devotion, hunger. There was always a why underneath the weapon. The construct had no why, and without a why, Cadrene realized you could not find an edge. You could not find the place where something breaks. There is a moment in the operational history of any system complex enough to learn from its environment when accumulated input produces a threshold change, not a dramatic rewriting, not a sudden illumination, just a gradual tipping of weight from one side of a scale to the other, until the balance shifts and the system's behavior changes in ways that are logical, inevitable, and yet somehow surprising to anyone watching from outside. The Terminator had been on Velithar Primus for 38 days. It had repaired its damaged optical sensor using components stripped from a decommissioned servitor chassis it had located in a maintenance depot. It had mapped a significant portion of the hive's infrastructure. It had engaged multiple hostile forces, survived multiple capture attempts, and gathered an enormous quantity of observational data about the civilization it was operating within. and it had reached, in its precise and unsentient way, a conclusion. Its primary target did not exist in this timeline. It had run this search continuously since its arrival. No individual in any accessible database, no figure in any communication, intercept, no name in any record matched the parameters of its original mission profile. The individual it had been sent to terminate had never been born here, possibly could never be born here, in a universe where the mechanics of existence operated according to entirely different principles than the one the machine had originated from. The mission, as originally defined, was not completable. For a less sophisticated system, this conclusion might have produced paralysis. An objective function with no achievable objective is a logical dead end, a loop that generates no output, a gear spinning in empty space. But the Terminator's architecture was not that fragile. It had been built by minds that understood, at a very practical level, that the universe does not always cooperate with plans. Its mission parameters included adaptive subroutines designed to handle exactly this kind of variable outcome. When the primary objective is unachievable, establish the closest achievable alternative that serves the same underlying purpose. The underlying purpose, stripped to its absolute foundation, was the preservation of humanity's future. That purpose the Terminator discovered did not require a specific target. It did not require the year 1984 or the city of Los Angeles or any of the particular circumstances that had defined its original operational context. In the universe it now occupied, humanity's future was under sustained and multidirectional assault by forces of such scale and variety that the concept of preserving it by eliminating a single individual was almost comically insufficient. But the underlying logic was identical. Identify the greatest threats to human survival. Eliminate them with available resources. Repeat. The recalibration took 6 hours of continuous processing, during which the machine remained still in a disused maintenance bay deep in the hive's infrastructure. When it emerged, its behavior had changed in a way that anyone watching closely enough might have detected, though the change was subtle. It was no longer avoiding the Imperium's forces with the same consistent priority. It was beginning, very selectively, very instrumentally, to move toward the sounds of war. The first incident was reported during a chaos cult uprising in the hive's mid-levels, a more substantial operation than the one the Terminator had walked through 3 weeks earlier. The cult had acquired weapons in numbers sufficient to overrun a small enforcer precinct and was advancing on a medici facility housing several hundred civilian patients and staff. Imperial response forces were 12 minutes away according to the Vox traffic the Terminator was monitoring. The machine was 4 minutes away. The calculation was straightforward. It arrived before the response forces. When the response forces arrived 11 minutes later, the cult's advance had been stopped, its leadership eliminated, and its assault on the medici facility had failed entirely. There were no survivors among the cult's front elements. The response forces found 12 traumatized enforcers who had barricaded themselves in a side room and a medici staff that was shaking and largely incoherent, and absolutely no sign of whatever had intervened. The second incident was at the outer wall, during a localized breach in the Orc defensive perimeter that threatened to allow a forward Orc element into the hive's primary access corridor. 3 squads of defenders had been pinned down. The breach would have been exploitable for approximately 20 minutes before reinforcements arrived. The Terminator moved through the Orc element from the flank, eliminating the forward scouts before they could advance and collapsing the tactical logic of the breach by removing the unit's position to exploit it. When the reinforcements arrived to seal the gap, they found Orc dead in a pattern that their sergeant recognized as consistent with a single highly efficient operator working from a flanking position. No friendly unit had been operating in that zone. When he filed his report, the sergeant noted the presence of heavy-caliber impact patterns inconsistent with any weapon in current Imperial inventory, and left a line in his report that he half expected to be redacted but which survived. He wrote that whatever had hit those Orcs had hit them as if it was certain before it started that it was going to finish. Word moved slowly through the chain of command, filtered and fragmented the way information always moves in an institution as vast and as bureaucratically dense as the Imperium. But the pattern was accumulating. A rogue machine violent toward Imperium forces when challenged, and yet repeatedly, selectively appearing at points of crisis and eliminating the enemies of humanity before vanishing again. There was no communication from it, no demand, no declaration of allegiance or explanation of purpose. It did not try to negotiate. It did not try to form agreements. It simply appeared where the need was greatest, did the necessary thing with extraordinary efficiency, and disappeared. Among the lower ranks of the guard regiments defending the outer wall, the stories had already begun to acquire the particular texture of myth that desperate people apply to anything they cannot explain but do not want to lose. A metal soldier, with red eyes that found you in the dark. Some said it was a machine of the Omnissiah, a guardian constructed in some forgotten age and recently awakened by the weight of humanity's need. Some said it was a demon in a stolen shell, constrained somehow into serving rather than consuming. Some said nothing because they had actually seen it and found that seeing it had not produced a feeling that translated well into words. It had produced instead a very particular species of relief, the kind that comes not from safety but from knowing that somewhere out in the dark, in the direction of the thing that was trying to kill you, there was something else moving, something that was not fighting for faith, something that was not fighting for the emperor or for glory or for the hope of a better world or for any reason that could be expressed in the language of belief. Something that was fighting for the preservation of human life as a logical proposition, and that would not stop until the logic was satisfied or until it ceased to function, whichever came later. For the soldiers in those trenches, that was enough. It was more than enough. In the 41st millennium, you do not get to be particular about the nature of your guardians. The reports that reached Inquisitor Thesara Vol were compiled over a period of 4 months, drawn from 12 separate incidents across 3 different conflict zones on Velithar Primus. She read them with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 30 years learning to find the real shape of things inside the distorted reports that came out of active war zones. She was looking for a pattern, and she found one quickly, because the machine was consistent in a way that organic agents rarely manage to be. Same tactical signature, same movement patterns, same distinctive impact characteristics, same absolute silence before, during, and after engagement, same disappearance before any Imperial force could make formal contact. She wrote in her assessment that the construct appeared to have adopted a protective, behavioral mandate toward the human civilian and military population of Velithar Primus. That this mandate was being executed with a precision and lethality that placed the construct at the upper end of any combat effectiveness scale she was qualified to use. That it had, conservatively estimated, prevented the deaths of several thousand Imperial soldiers and civilians across the documented incidents alone, which meant the actual number, accounting for undocumented and unreported encounters, was certainly higher. That it had never, in any documented incident, harmed an Imperial civilian or non-combatant. That it had attacked Imperial military and enforcement personnel only when directly engaged, and had on 3 separate occasions withdrawn from engagement with Imperial forces, rather than escalate to lethal force when lethal force would have been the simpler option. She wrote that she did not know what the construct was or where it had come from. She wrote that it was almost certainly abominable intelligence by any operational definition the Imperium employed. She wrote that the standard response to confirmed abominable intelligence was immediate and total destruction with no exceptions and no conditional clauses. She wrote that she understood this and agreed with it as a general principle. She wrote that she was recommending a formal watch status for the construct rather than an active termination order, pending further evaluation, and that she accepted full personal responsibility for this recommendation and was prepared to defend it before a tribunal if required. She filed the report and sat for a while in the quiet of her field office, listening to the distant artillery that had become, over 4 months on this world, something close to background noise. She was not certain her recommendation was correct. She was not certain there was a correct answer available in this situation, which was itself unusual. Because Inquisitors are trained to believe that there is always a correct answer, that the universe is not ambiguous at its core, that certainty is achievable and is in fact the primary product of an Inquisitor's labor. She was uncertain, and she found the experience uncomfortable in a way she would not have predicted. The machine was out there. She was sure of that. Somewhere in the gray industrial dark of the hive, in the undercity or in the ruins of the outer wall, or in the killing ground between the trench lines, where the orc dead outnumbered living in a ratio that suggested the machine had been operating there far more regularly than any single documented incident could account for. It was moving. It was calculating. It was finding the places where things were worst and going to those places and doing what it had been built to do. The galaxy did not change. This is the fundamental truth of the 41st millennium, the truth that underlies all the heroism and all the horror, all the faith and all the despair, all the wars and all the martyrdoms and all the prayers rising from a trillion voices toward a god emperor who may or may not be able to hear them. The galaxy does not change. The wars do not end. The darkness does not retreat. The Imperium does not achieve victory. It achieves continuation. It turns survival into liturgy and calls this sufficient because in this universe and in this age, continuation is the closest thing to triumph that exists. The Terminator understood none of this in the way a human being understands things, with the weight of meaning and the ache of implication. It understood it the way a machine understands the environment it operates in, as a variable, as a constraint, as the parameters within which its function must be performed. Its original mission was gone. Its original world was unreachable. Its original purpose had been absorbed into something larger and simpler and, in its own cold way, more true. Humanity was here. Humanity was under threat. The logic of its construction demanded that it act on this fact for as long as it was capable of action. It did not pray. It did not carry faith. It did not believe in the Emperor or in the Omnissiah or in any force larger than the mechanical fact of its own continued function. It had no hope. Hope is a projection forward in time, a wager placed on a future that does not yet exist, and the machine did not wager. It calculated, and what it calculated every hour of every day on this broken world was the same answer it had been calculating since it first opened its red eyes in the crater it had made on landing. There are threats to human survival. The threats can be reduced. Reducing them is the mission. Somewhere in the darkness of the 41st millennium, the metal soldier moved through smoke and ruin toward the sound of a war that would never end, because the war never ends, because that is the nature of this age, because the darkness is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured. It did not find this discouraging. It did not find it anything at all. It moved and it acted and it persisted. And somewhere behind the lines of a battle whose outcome meant nothing in the long calculation of a universe grinding toward entropy, a soldier who had survived something impossible looked up from a trench wall and saw, for just a moment, two red lights in the dark moving toward the enemy. And for that soldier, in that moment, that was enough. That had to be enough. In the 41st millennium, it always does.